Hey guys, today I'm just continuing to cover my match against Cool Thing. I'm going through these games in no particular order, um, but I had a 6 game match against him. We played another game the next day, which was drawn, so I guess we've had 7 recently, and it's been about even. Um, I just wanted to look at this one because there were some kind of interesting structural features. So I'm starting out basically like I'm going for 7 pawns, or maybe I will go into a Muj. Um, White is basically setting up either a Sheik with d4 or a Saif with f4. So I play c5 just to kind of see what direction White is headed. Um, h6 is another good move I can play, basically just waiting around to see how White's going to react, although I figured that White would probably go for a Sheik there, and the interpretation of the Mujannah that I've been trying to play involves having the bishop on h6 if we're talking about having this setup, which is what I went for in one of my other games in the match. So that's why I didn't want to play the h6 waiting move here, so instead I played c5 in this game. And here White played c4, going for basically this like Botvinnik English with knight c3. Mayonnaise is the player who plays this setup with White the most, and probably has had some of the most success over the past couple years. So f5, I decided to just basically play this like a Mujana. This is just, again, it's just kind of a very interesting structural plan. The move f4 is basically saying to White, well, okay, if you continue along your plan and you try to play for d4, then the e4 pawn is going to be weakened. And if White continues to just try to play for the b4 break, I'm hoping that my extra space on the Fursian side will compensate. So the f5 idea is a pretty good idea, I think, very playable for black. Knight c3, knight c6, rook b1, and knight f6, knight ge2. White is getting ready to try to make this push. I play a6, the idea being actually after b3, if I want, I can actually be the first to play the b5 break. So I can play rook b8, a3, and if I want, I can go into this. So the basic idea is c takes, a takes, b4. And here black can choose how to proceed. Something wild like c4, I don't know if it's any good, or maybe just takes, and continue to play this game. So that's an idea for me, and that's kind of the idea with a6. I decided to play h6 and to try for it this way, basically just getting ready to double on the b file. And when I went to play h6, my mouse slipped and I played the move g5 instead. So g5 is probably a bad move. You notice it weakens the f5 pawn. And I think the way for White to take advantage of this would be to just try to capture the pawn right away. A couple ideas here. So bishop h3 comes to mind, the idea f4, then just takes, and takes. This is probably pretty good for White, getting the 2 pawns for the Fursian. And after bishop h3, another idea might be knight to e7. So knight to e7 is probably like a better move. And I guess f4, the thought would be to meet it with g4. And black seems to be doing okay here. So bishop h3 probably isn't the right way to take advantage of this situation, but f4 looks pretty good. Black pushes past with g4, knight g3 is going to be a real problem. Knight to e7 or something like that. White's going to play d4, bring the bishop out, and this pawn is going to be in some trouble. So that looks pretty good for white. Even here, the move d4 immediately is playable. So I don't really like g4. G takes. It's going to run into knight takes. Maybe bishop h6 here. Knight to d5. Takes. And probably the best that black has here. Well, he's got to defend the b pawn, so he's going to play rook b8. And here, white can maybe just continue like g3, shore up to f4 square, play bishop h3, rook f1. Black is going to be surviving here, but this position looks a little bit more pleasant for white to play. Just rook f1 followed by rook b2 and rook f2. White's play here is really going to flow. Black's probably doing all right, but at some point you may have to ditch the f pawn, which could be a little uncomfortable. So I think that kind of plan would be likely to give white some advantage. Maybe g3 first is a little more patient way to play. But I think that white should go ahead and take advantage of this weakness. But I got a little bit lucky in the game. White instead played g3. I brought my fursan up and then a3, and so I got a chance to be able to retake on f5 with the fursan. So you know, that's good for black. White plays pawn to h3. The idea here is to just gain space and maybe try to break with h4 or e takes and g4. And typically, when white is coming up with these ideas, the way for black to play is to continue to take space himself on this side of the board. Rook g1, looks like white's preparing to play takes and g4 or something. So I just continue to gain space with h5. White plays pawn to b4, and black is getting ready to try to play this g4 break and really try to completely open up the fursan side. So first I bring my rook over. And here white makes a very interesting decision. So this is kind of the structure that I want to talk about. Black is getting ready to probably next move play pawn to g4. So like let's say that white just plays king c2, something innocuous. Here g4 is going to be a try. And you know, the idea is really like e takes, then this fursan will come up. And then if takes h4, here black has a pretty easy game. Just play rook f7, followed by probably knight h5 and maybe bishop h6 and double along the f file. And this bishop on f1 really looks misplaced here. So even though white probably is going to get an opportunity to bring his fursan up to a good square, maybe something like this, black seems to be doing fairly well anyway, just because he's going to have good pressure along the f file. And that's hopefully going to just be enough to compensate for white having this advanced fursan. So that's basically black's idea, is to try to get the move g4 in. And white, interestingly enough, played h4 here himself, basically to try to force this position and force me to play g4. But there are of course other approaches that we have to look for white here. So what are the moves that white has? Well, e takes f5 comes to mind, in addition to h4. So e takes would be a pretty direct way to play. If I recapture with a pawn, this is probably not going to be great for me because after h4, g4, now I probably am just letting this Furzian come in, and my own Furzian is blocked in. So I'm not going to have a very active game, and I've weakened the d5 square. So that's why I would retake with a Furzian, and now probably pawn to g4, and then after takes, white wants to keep this pawn on h3 where it's going to be well defended, and play f takes. The idea is now this rook is just going to be biting on granite because the elephant always defends it. So then probably I would drop the Furzian back. White might try something like rook to b2 and then rook to f2. So I might play rook f7, white plays knight g3. The idea just being rook f2 and knight on g to e4. I think this position is probably about equal. The computer seems to like white and gives white maybe about a half pawn up. But structurally, I think probably just after bishop h6, to me, I'm not really seeing the advantage for white. So, rook f2, probably just rook hf8. I think the computer is probably looking at the long-term weakness of the g5 pawn. But I think it's going to be hard for white to reroute a knight to f3 in order to take advantage of that. So so rook to a7, and after h4, then I play g4, and it's not really clear that black has an advantage yet. My suspicion, though, is that going into e takes, and g4, which is probably about equal. This is probably white's best option, but instead white played h4 himself, and then that forces me to play g4. And here we actually see a mistake, though. White plays f takes g4, which I don't think is good. So I think white probably has to play f4 here to try to block up the Furzian side, because black has such a big space advantage there. So white's got to block it up. In terms of how black can proceed, well, I mean, there's any number of just kind of like shifty rook moves, or maybe bringing the other rook in or something. But I don't know that any of those are that promising in terms of getting an advantage for black. Black is basically just kind of sitting still. I think the most interesting try would be f takes, just winning a center pawn, but allowing white a good square for development. And then maybe takes, and rook c7 to target the c4 pawn. So the idea would be something like after bishop d3, black plays a5. If push, then probably just, well, knight can come into b4, and this is going to be really ugly for white. And if takes, we play knight takes. There's this exchange, knight takes c4, rook moves away, and probably black plays something like e5 here, just kind of cementing the center. And it looks to me like black has a pretty active game. I think with the idea of rook h7, maybe this elephant comes out to defend the knight, and then rook b7. It looks a little bit easier to play with black. So I kind of like black's position there. I think the computer gives a slight advantage to white, but again, I'm not really seeing it in terms of practical chances. It looks to me like black has a much easier game. But I think f4 was necessary, because after f takes, now I play knight takes g4. I think this is the best move. So in these kinds of structures, the computer always goes nuts for h takes g. The idea is just coming in towards the center. Um, and then, after e takes, play Fursan takes. And black certainly has an easy game here. He's just going to play knight h5, elephant over, and then double. So there's going to be good chances for black long term. That being said, I don't think that it's quite as easy as you would think. So white to move probably plays ff4. Then if bishop h6 here, probably then rook b2. Or maybe even throw in takes. Now just rook b2. And I guess long term, black's plan is probably going to be to get a knight into f3. It looks pretty good for black, but I actually kind of prefer the move that I play because I think it's a lot more active. And I think the winning tries are a lot more concrete. So instead of h takes g4, I just play knight takes g4. And the idea here is super simple. I'm just going to double, and I'm going to play knight c5, and I'm going to come in on these squares. And I always have f takes e4 just to open up the position. And so white just opened a b file, and he brought his Fursan in. I went ahead and kicked the Fursan. Fursan comes into g5. But now I play knight c to e5, and I think I'm very, very close to winning here. Because the threat of knight to f3 is going to be really hard to meet. White plays rook g2, just some prophylaxis to get the rook off, and now I just continue to double. Rook f8, king e1, rook af7, and this really is just starting to look absolutely awful for white. I'm going to take, and this elephant is going to hang, but the elephant has to continue to defend d3. So white plays e takes, but now I just play rook takes. And then after bishop to h3, I have the little tactical shot, knight takes d3, king d2, and then rook f2. So I get my rook out of harm's way while also threatening rook takes g2 and forcing this where the elephant is attacked. So that, that's good for me. Of course, even if I don't have the tactical shot, just rook to f3 and continuing to put pressure on the d3 square looks really good. There's not really a good way to stop, like rook takes d3 and then bringing the other rook in. So it's possible that just rook to f3 would have been even stronger. So we see takes, rook f2, takes, knight takes f2. Oh, white played rook b7, and actually here I should just play knight takes h3. I chickened out a little bit. I'm not exactly sure what I was afraid of. Maybe knight takes h3, maybe rook g7. Just looked a little uncomfortable on this Fursan. But okay, I can come up. It's no big deal. Yeah, so I should probably just grab the elephant. Instead, I decided to trade this off right away. Takes, bishop f1, fg6. And here I did manage to convert this endgame. I'm up a pretty nice pawn and have a really great active position otherwise. So it wasn't too bad to manage to convert this, even with the opposite colored Fursans. Particularly given how many knights are on the board, that's what really makes it easy to convert. That this position despite the opposite colored Furzians. So I'll put a link to the full game below, but in case you're interested, you can check it out. But I think just the takeaways from this, I just am looking at kind of the opening structure. And so in this Botvinnik English, this is the system that I've been playing sometimes, basically playing a moosh against it. And g5 is premature. White probably should play e takes f. But the structure that I ended up achieving in the game after this position with the 3 pawns up here, this is just a structure that's been coming up a lot in a lot of games, and I think that it's very good for the side that has the 3 pawns. And the idea of just coming in with g4, this just kind of leads to a very nice game for black. Again, I think white needs to box up this structure and try to seal off the Furzian side rather than allowing f takes, knight takes g4, and here the kind of the winning plan is super easy to find, and it's not very easy for white to really do much about that. Probably the computer defends it really well, but between humans and a blitz game, that's not going to be very easy at all. So thank you guys.